This week on Q&A, author and journalist Evan Thomas discusses his latest historical narrative titled Ike's Bluff, President Eisenhower's Secret Battle to Save the World.
Evan Thomas, author of Ike's Bluff. Sub-discussion throughout the entire book, Ike's health. Why?
Yeah. Well, he had a heart attack in office, a serious one. He had a stroke. He had ileitis, stomach operation. I mean, and he was old. He was, at the time, the oldest president ever. He smoked 4 packs a day up till 1949. I mean, his health was not great. He was a robust man in so many ways, but he was an older man with some serious health issues, and they got to him.
Dr. Snyder.
Yeah. Dr. Snyder was his personal doctor, lived very close to the White House, seemed to be there 24/7, kept a daily diary. This was crucial to me, and I used it in a way I think other biographers have not. Kept a daily diary from 1955 on about the president's mood. Why? Because they feared that if Ike blew up or if he got too tense or too worried, he'd have another heart attack. And Eisenhower, used to say, what do they think this, they would say, Mr. President, you have to be more relaxed. You can't worry so much. And he would say, what do they think this job is? Because of course he worried. So that was a constant sub-theme in the White House, was keeping Ike from having another heart attack.
Who was Howard Snyder?
Howard Snyder was his personal doctor. He was older. He had been an Army surgeon. Kind of happenstance that he became a doctor. He really wasn't properly trained to be. In fact, he misdiagnosed Ike's heart attack in 1955. He got away with it, but he thought it was indigestion. Then they covered it up with the records. But Ike could have died in 1955. He was not a great technical doctor, but he was a good old-fashioned general practitioner. He knew his patient emotionally, which I think was as important or more important than any kind of medical training he could have brought to the table.
And where did he meet him?
He met him in the Army as an Army doctor when Ike was an officer in the late 40s, and became his doctor when Ike was first, I guess, attached. Ike was Army Chief of Staff. Then he was the first Supreme Allied Commander in Europe in 1950, and that's when it was about the late 1940s when he became Ike's personal doctor.
Your chapter 17 starts off, when Eisenhower was feeling down or under stress, he sometimes lashed out at his doctors, the only people he could safely blame.
Yeah. Well, Ike was an old-fashioned figure in the sense that he kept his emotions, and he didn't, unlike our modern age where everybody's sharing their feelings all the time. That was not Ike. Ike is 1900 Kansas. But like everybody, Ike needs somebody to blame, and he used his personal doctor as somebody he could get mad at. Now, he did blow up in his office at other people as well. Ike, one of the things I write about is that Ike had a temper, a real temper. It was like staring into a Bessemer steel furnace, according to one of his aides, when he blew up. And Ike would periodically blow up at his doctor, even throwing his golf club at him one time.
In the next sentence, on New Year's Eve 1956, with the Suez and Hungary crises still smoldering, Howard Snyder had found his patient, quote, in an evil state of mind. Well, where did you find the diaries?
They're in Abilene. The Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene. They've been there for maybe 10 or 15 years. They were used by there's a book by a guy named Lasby, who's wrote a book for an academic press about Ike's health, and he used them. But popular historians, for reasons I don't quite understand, have not used them. I got a lot of use out of them. They're all there. They're open to the public. Anybody can see them.
Where'd you go to get them?
Abilene. I went out to the Presidential Library. Like all Ike biographers, I spent time at the Presidential Library, and you just ask for them. You
say in the acknowledgments that a fellow named John Newhouse got you interested in this book.
Yeah. John Newhouse was a longtime Washington figure, a correspondent, wrote for the New Yorker, and we were having lunch one day some years ago, and he started talking about the Dulles brothers, Allen and John Foster. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, Allen Dulles, head of the CIA. And I'd written a book about the CIA, which we talked about many years ago. And he said, well, would you like to do the Dulles brothers as a biography? He had thought about it. he's getting older. He said, why don't you try it? And I said, I was interested. But then he started, the conversation drifted off to Eisenhower, to the boss of the Dulles brothers. And Newhouse said something to me that was very interesting. He said that General Goodpaster, who had been Ike's chief staff secretary, but really his chief national security advisor in that form as it was in the 1950s, had known Newhouse and talked to him and said, you know, the thing about Eisenhower is that he would never tell anybody whether he was going to use nuclear weapons. Now, why is this important? Because in the 1950s, nuclear weapons were pretty new, and we threatened to use them at various stages. Ike did. But nobody ever knew whether he was serious or not, whether he meant it. And of course, to be credible as a deterrent, you have to be credible. And Ike never told anybody. And I was fascinated by that notion. Talk about the loneliness of command. The use of nuclear weapons. What could be a greater command decision than that? Here was a guy who had run the Allied invasion in World War II, liberated Europe, but now he's president, and he has an even greater level of responsibility at a time when nuclear weapons are new. The Soviets are getting them, we've got them, not just one or two, but we're building a whole arsenal. Tactical nuclear weapons, H-bombs. Are we going to use these things or not? And Ike used them as a tool. He embraced this unusable weapon as a tool basically to avoid any war. And that's what the book is about. It's how Ike used nuclear weapons to essentially bluff to avoid any war. He didn't want to even get into little wars because, central insight, Eisenhower knew that little wars lead to big wars, that wars get out of control.
Who was older, John Foster Dulles or Allen Dulles?
John Foster's the older brother. Allen is the younger brother.
And John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, Allen Dulles, CIA.
Right.
You say that Eisenhower hated him, Allen Dulles.
Well, Eisenhower came, at first tolerated him because to run the CIA, you need, as Eisenhower said, a kind of a genius, a different kind of genius, a spy master. And at first, Dulles was that man for Eisenhower. But as time went on, and Dulles became sort of looser around the edges and distracted and older, and the CIA, which had had some early successes, the overthrow of the governments in Guatemala and Iran, as they started having some blunders, coup plots that failed, Eisenhower began to distrust Dulles. But one of his failings, and Eisenhower was not perfect. I've written a flattering biography, but he was not perfect. He should have fired Dulles because by the end the CIA was out of control, and as I write in the book, really came a cropper at the very end in 1960 when the Paris summit, very important, with Khrushchev to try to bring détente into the Cold War. The CIA did not warn Eisenhower that the U-2 spy plane was at risk of getting shot down, flying over Russia, very important, spying over, getting information. But Bissell, who was the head of covert operations at the CIA, did not warn the President of the United States, big oversight, that this plane could get shot down, and it did get shot down. At 1960, Francis Gary Powers, big to-do. That was the end of détente for a long period of time, and the Cold War entered a very dangerous phase. So the CIA basically betrayed Ike. I think that's a strong word, but maybe not too strong a word at the end here. And for that reason, Eisenhower was really, I think, mad at himself that he didn't fire Dulles. I talked to Eisenhower's son, John, who was 90 years old, very much alert, has all his marbles. I had lunch with him recently. Really interesting guy who worked in the White House for his father, worked for Andy Goodpaster, for the staff secretary. And John Eisenhower, as they flew to that failed summit meeting, John Eisenhower went to his father and said, "You should have fired him." And Eisenhower blew up defensively, told off his son. He blew up, I think, because he was mad at himself that he hadn't gotten rid of Allen Dulles earlier.
And I remember the quote, something like, you're not president, why, which is very, very critical of his son.
Yeah. This reminded me actually of George Bush. George Bush and Eisenhower were similar. George Bush, H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, were similar. They didn't boast much. They had a kind of a natural confidence, but every once in a while they would say things like, "I'm president and you're not." George Bush would say that famously. And Eisenhower, in this case, said to his son, "I'm the president. You're not." And it's a kind of it's in a way a feeble defense. I mean, it's sort of, don't question my judgment. And Eisenhower was not that way normally. Eisenhower welcomed criticism, and he would engage in debate, and he would bring his subordinates in. But on something like this, I think he knew that he'd blown it, and he regretted it.
What book is this for you?
Number 8.
Of all those, which sold the best?
I wrote a World War II book called Sea of Thunder that sold over 100,000 copies in hardback.
Which sold the least?
I think my CIA book might have been, I'm not sure to tell you the truth. Either my CIA book, authors should know these things, or a book I wrote, my last book, which was called The War Lovers, about Teddy Roosevelt, and both those books sold less than 20,000 copies.
When did you decide that this was going to be a flattering portrait of Dwight Eisenhower?
It's hard to say. You know, it's sort of a slow process. Authors, the cliche is that authors fall in love with their subjects, and then they kind of fall out in love with them, and then have to reconcile that. I would say I was predisposed to like Eisenhower for one big reason. I'm fascinated with the idea of confidence that is so great that you don't have to pretend or bluff. We live in this celebrity age where people are always showing off, and Eisenhower is a throwback figure to somebody who's so confident he could be humble. I'm so interested in people who are so confident they can afford to be humble. They don't have to show off. Arrogant people are generally insecure. I'm at my worst when I'm afraid. I can be arrogant when I'm afraid. When I'm insecure, I'm arrogant. When I'm secure, I'm more humble. And that phenomenon interests me, and Eisenhower really represented that kind of secure confidence, even though, as I say in the book, he was seething with anger and he had a lot of fear and insecurity, but he had this basic confidence that allowed him to kind of rise above things, to keep his own counsel, to experience the loneliness of command, to take on responsibility in a way that was really unusual.
About every chapter you have a quote from John Eisenhower from an interview. How often did you see John Eisenhower, and what did you learn from him that nobody has ever printed that you know of?
I had lunch with Eisenhower 3 times and interviewed him over the phone several times. Susan Eisenhower, his daughter, got me too. And she'll be the first to tell you that Dad can be a little cranky. And he can be. He's a cantankerous guy in some ways, but he's really smart. And he's really honest. And he's honest about his father. And he came right out, and this is new, he came right out and said to me, "Good luck. I don't understand my own father. Good luck." And he's clearly been spending a lot of time in his life trying to figure out Dad. And he engaged with me in this process of let's figure out my father. And he was funny and charming and amazingly honest. There was a moment there when he said we were weighing the genial, warm, sunny Eisenhower against the cold-blooded Eisenhower, sort of 50-50. And John Eisenhower said, well, make that 75% cold-blooded. Now that's an unusual son who's honest enough to talk that way about his own father. He loved his father. It was a loving relationship, no question about it. But it was a complicated relationship because can you imagine being Dwight Eisenhower's son? John Eisenhower begins his memoirs with a great first sentence. He says, "I sometimes think that I was born standing at attention." Very tough to have a father who's always lecturing you on deportment, as Dwight Eisenhower did to his own son John. But John, remarkable man.
You quoted Susan at length, but didn't quote David Eisenhower except through his book.
I did interview David Eisenhower. David was sort of one step more guarded with me than Susan. I spent a lot of time with Susan and John, but David was friendly, he was polite, he's a very nice man, but I sensed in him a bit of reserve. I sent him the manuscript saying, here it is, got no response. I did hear back from Susan, made some fixes based on what she told me. Sent it to John. Basically all he did was send me a blurb on the back saying, very flattering blurb, saying you got as close to my dad as anybody's going to. But David, I think, has been more in the public eye in a way. You know, he's married to Julie. Julie Nixon, excuse me. That can make you a little warier. His book, I should say, is fantastic. It was a great source for me. David Eisenhower wrote a book about his grandfather's retirement. What's the title? Something like In All His Glory or something like that. But it's about Ike after he's president, and it's a fantastically warm, affectionate, funny memoir, and I did use that.
What'd you learn from Susan?
Susan, I learned, I was very interested in Mamie, who does not play a great role in advising Ike, but whose marriage was important. And Susan told me the kind of things the little things that make a difference. That, for instance, Mamie dressed carefully for Ike and wore clothes that showed off her bosom and her waist. There was some sex life between these folks. And, Ike was a very handsome guy, virile guy. Here are the wedding pictures of them. And they, there's all this chatter about Kay Summersby and Ike having a mistress in World War II. He may or may not have slept with Kay Summersby, but he had a real love with his own wife. And Susan helped me understand that. Susan's also a very savvy public observer.
I think that's her right there.
That's the baby, yeah. Yeah, it could be. With Granny. Yeah, look at that. Susan and David were close. He was a good grandfather. He paid attention to his grandkids. And Susan was a rider, and she has a wonderful story about her horse getting loose and tearing up the putting green at Gettysburg where they lived. And she thought, oh my God, Grandpa's going to let me have it. But he didn't. He was sweet with her and controlled, and showed his self-control and his graciousness.
Mamie Eisenhower, did she have a drinking problem? And the whole thing, the picture that you paint in there is they were at each other's throat, but yet very close. And there's a quote once from Dr. Snyder, I think in his diary, where he told her to go wrap herself around her husband to keep him warm.
Yeah. When he had his heart attack, one thing Snyder did right about this, he misdiagnosed it, but he told Mamie to get in bed and fold her husband because he was in shock and chilled. That was actually plain-spoken, old-fashioned medical advice that worked. But it gets at a larger thing. Mamie and Ike were the first president, I believe, in a long time to share the same bed. They may have been the first presidents that I know of. They slept in the same bed. And they had a close physical and personal relationship, even though they snarked at each other, they fought. Mamie was high-strung. She was sort of paranoid about her husband's health. They would clash, and this is all in Snyder's diary. But there was nonetheless, Snyder has one scene where they're at each other all day long, crabbing at each other, and yet at 4 o'clock in the morning, Snyder's in the White House, he records that Ike gets up in the morning, and he was sleeping. He'd gone to sulk in his dressing room, and he gets up and he crawls into bed with his wife. That's very important. Those intimate things are so important to somebody who has to deal with the responsibility of handling an arsenal of nuclear weapons.
How extensive were Howard Snyder's diaries?
Usually a paragraph or two every day. They would come and go a little bit. Ike and Snyder had a bit of a falling out towards the very end over a sort of a jealous spat, and unfortunately their diaries are less full right around the time of the Paris summit. But generally, it's about a paragraph a day.
At what times were you surprised by what you read, and did Howard Snyder know that these diaries would become public?
I don't think he did. I mean, he would quote Ike a couple of times saying, "Okay, Howard, let's get drunk." Now, I'm not sure the personal doctor would have, if he'd known that those things were coming public, would have put something like that in. Or intimate details about his stomach was always acting up. There are a lot of stories about Ike's flatulence. I mean, very personal stuff that I don't think a doctor would want out. But one way or another, it made its way, I guess, through Snyder's family to the Eisenhower Library, and now it's public. And historians are lucky that it is.
How long has it been public?
I'm trying to remember this. I think late 90s. I think it was bequeathed to the library.
There's also a discussion a lot in here from the diary of Ann Whitman.
Yeah.
Who was she, and what was Mamie Eisenhower's reaction to Ann Whitman?
Ann Whitman was Ike's personal secretary, incredibly important to him, really good at her job. And she kept a diary, which is also very useful and I used in the Eisenhower Library. But she and Mamie did not get along. Some backstory on that. Mamie, of course, had been jealous of Kay Summersby, the English driver who allegedly, I'm not sure if this is true, but allegedly had an affair with Ike during World War II. So 2 weeks after Ike hires Whitman, Mrs. Whitman, in the 1952 campaign, Mamie tries to get her fired. It's a rival. And Ike gets her to calm down. Mrs. Whitman stays in her side. Mamie stays in her. Mamie only visited the Oval Office 4 times in 8 years. That was Mrs. Whitman's domain. Mamie's domain was the White House, was the residence, and they had sort of an uneasy peace. Although after Ike retired, Mrs. Whitman came out to Gettysburg and didn't last that long. I think there was some friction with Mamie then, and she then went to work for Nelson Rockefeller.
I'm pulling out a lot of the personal stuff primarily because so much has been on this network about Dwight Eisenhower that some of this I had not seen before, including the fact you said he played 800 rounds of golf in 8 years. That comes out to about 2 rounds of golf a week. And we see complaints today about Barack Obama playing too much golf. Has he come close to the kind of golf that...
No, I saw some number on Obama. I think it was like 100 times or something. Not close. Ike played a lot of golf. Now, he took some grief about this while he was president. And in fact, developed this kind of reputation as a golf-playing, kind of out-of-it caretaker president. So there was a political cost. Ike's own view was that it was essential for his mental health, that to be a commander, he needed to be out on the golf course and relaxing. As I write in the book, however, it was not a good game to relax. Any golfers out there know that golf is not a game of perfect, as they say, and Ike was tense, and he blew up. As I said, he threw his club at his doctor once. He was not an easy doctor, and if anything, I think sometimes the golf didn't relax him, it made him more tense.
You say in your book that he thought Milton Eisenhower's brother could be his successor in 1956?
Yeah. He was very close to his brother, who was the president of Penn State and would drive down every weekend and stay in the White House until he found out that Ike was paying for him to stay in the White House some fee, and then he stayed at the Mayflower Hotel. Typical scrupulous, cost-conscious Kansans. Anyways, Milton, there's not much record of what Milton said to Ike. Those notes weren't taken. Milton has kind of a bland memoir. But clearly Ike valued Milton because he said in various letters that he thought he could be president of the United States. Obviously impossible. The president's brother's not going to follow him. Well, maybe not so impossible. Look at the Bush family. But it didn't happen and was unlikely.
He was president 1953 to 1960, the end of 60. He was, if I calculate this right, he was 63 to about 70.
He was 70. He had turned 70 in November of 1960. So he was 70, and that made him at the time the oldest president ever. He was 70 at JFK's inauguration.
It struck me though that 63 to 70, and he was sick all that time and tense all that time after he had won World War II, among other things.
Yeah, I mean, World War II will take a toll out of you. I don't think he ate a lot of steaks. By modern standards, he didn't have the healthiest diet. He did quit smoking, but 4 packs a day from 1915 or 1910 to 1949, that's a lot of Camel cigarettes. And it took a toll on him, and his stomach was in bad shape. I think he had a latus, which was something wrong with his intestine. They had to operate on it. But it was mostly a nervous stomach. When he gave a really important speech, he'd get sick. He gave a famous speech early on about the chance for peace, and he could barely give it. His hands were shaking. He was sweating. He was skipping pages in his speech because he was afraid he was going to have an unfortunate accident. His stomach, a lot of people get nervous stomachs. Ike really did.
I wrote down a lot of words you used to describe him, and I don't know if this is going to work or not, but I'm going to mention them and just give us a little touch of what you meant by that.
Sure.
You said he was manipulative.
Well, he didn't always tell you what he wanted. He seemed to be plain and sunny, but he had a way of pushing people in a direction when they didn't even know they were being pushed.
You said he was crafty.
Well, he seemed to be honest and genial, but he could lie. I mean, he believed in the CIA. He was a big user of the CIA. He believed in deception and dissembling.
Mercurial.
Well, he had an enormous temper. He was sunny, but he had this temper that could go pow.
A romantic.
Well, I think he was romantic about the United States. He really loved his country. He loved his wife. He loved West Point, duty, honor, country. Those were not just romantic ideas. They were from his heart.
Hero worshiper.
He liked de Gaulle. Interestingly, Churchill, he was an admirer of. Washington, Lee. I mean, he had heroes.
Why Lee? And you point out that He was a big fan, and he lived on the Civil War battlefield at Gettysburg.
Lee's a complicated figure. Lee, on the one hand, was good because Lee cared about his troops. That was really important to Eisenhower, a general who cared about his troops. Basically a great strategist, but, importantly, he thought on the third day at Gettysburg, Lee made a big mistake by allowing Pickett to make the charge that failed, because Lee said to Pickett, "Do it if you can." Eisenhower, as a commander, never would have said to his combat commander, "Do it if you can." It was either you know you're going to win or you don't. You don't take a chance on something like that. Eisenhower was an all-or-nothing guy. Don't do it unless you're going to win. And so Ike thought Lee made a big mistake on the third day at Gettysburg, and that was an important lesson to him.
Another personal note, when he was president of Columbia University for, I think, 7 years,
yeah, only really, though, for 1 or 2. He was formally the president, but really only in 1949-50.
And went back to NATO for a while?
Yes.
But you say that, what I'm getting at is, where did he get his money to buy the farm in Gettysburg and places like that? Because you say that Mamie had to sell her stocks in order for them to buy a car when they were in New York at Columbia.
Yeah, he wrote a memoir of World War II and was paid $800,000, and he got a tax deal to treat it as capital gains. So he had at least $500,000 of cash, which he used to buy that farm. He also got some help from a friend named George Allen, who bought some of the land, I think, and had a farm next door. He had rich friends. Ike's buddies bought him a house down at Augusta, at the golf club down there. He got a lot of gifts. The rules were a little looser in those days.
Speaking of Augusta Golf Course, explain that business about them building a pond and putting fish in it so that he could have fish to catch.
Yeah, Augusta wanted Ike. He was their kind of guy. And his millionaire friends, they built a house for him and also a pond. They dug a pond there and put fish in it so that Ike could relax by fishing when the weather was bad.
Did we know that back in those years?
You know, I don't know. I'm not sure. People certainly knew about what it was called Mamie's Cottage. I'm not sure they knew the detail about the pond.
Back to the way you describe him, warmly human.
He sure could be. If you were in his presence, you felt his warmth. He had a great smile and this warmth that really flooded over him. Although if you were around him long enough, you also felt the cold side. Expansive. Well, he had a largeness about him. You know, he didn't get caught in the petty details. He was a big picture guy, you know. Conquer Europe, save the world. He thought in those terms. Patient? He was not patient when he was losing his temper, but he had a long view. He had a long view, and he only decided things when he had to. This is very important. I wish I was like this. He didn't make decisions too quickly. He would wait till the last second to decide. He had wisdom? Well, clearly, he had good judgment. The most ineffable and important quality of a leader, good judgment. He was wise. He made good calls. I'm using all these words because I don't, you know, is it hard, the question is it hard for a journalist like you all your life to use all these very positive things to describe anybody in politics? Well, it's true. I've been a snarky journalist for much of my career, and I've used a lot of critical terms. But I think these all are true of Ike. He was a complicated figure. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. I point that out in the book. He made some big ones. Cunning. Well, he was back to shrewd, manipulative, savvy, all that. He could outfox his opponents. He was good at hiding the ball. I'm not the first to discover this. I mean, the hidden hand idea Fred Greenstein at Princeton talked about. Other scholars have come before me and established this ground. There's a guy named Campbell Craig who wrote a wonderful book about Ike's nuclear policy. These are not discoveries by me, but I told the story. How did you go about writing a book about a man that lots and lots of books have been written? Well, I don't think that I made it much more personal. I mean, we've just been talking about all these personal things that, as you said yourself, are not front and, they're in there, but they're not front and center in other biographies. So I got more personal. I did presidential biographies are, I think, boring because there's too much going on. Presidents do too much. They do 7 different things an hour. I took really one narrative, Ike keeping us out of war, keeping us out of nuclear war. Pretty exciting narrative, I think. And I just focused on that. While we're on the writing of this for a moment, you talk about
a famous person in the back of your book who is not famous to most people, but to people who follow books, Mike Hill.
Mike Hill, my resercher, my wonderful researcher who's helped me.
You're not the only one he researches.
Yeah, David McCullough, Nat Philbrick, there are others. But he's had a long client list over the years, and he's a warm, wonderful, and great with librarians. Man, is he good.
How does he do his work, and how does he fit into your work?
He does it lots of different ways. He goes out, he does advanced work. He went out to Abilene and met the staff. He puts together a briefing book for me and what I need to know. He does an enormous amount of Xeroxing. He'll do that kind of stuff. But he's the kind of guy who he's a good friend of mine, and he knows the way I think and what I'm looking for. And the two of us, we went out to Abilene together. He has a good eye. I trust him. He's careful and thorough, and all the years he's worked with me, never complained. And I know from talking to other historians, Michael Beschloss has used him, John Meacham has used him, lots of historians have used him. He's really good.
So how else did you prepare yourself for this book? Where did you go?
I went to Gettysburg, of course, to his farm. I walked the battlefield by playing golf at El Dorado, where he retired. I never got on the course at Augusta. Of course, I've been in Washington. I really prepared for this book by being the Washington bureau chief of Newsweek for 10 years, and I've been in Washington since 1986 and a stint before that. In a way, I've been preparing my whole life to write this book. I wrote The Wise Men with Walter Isaacson long ago that was about this period. I wrote a biography of Bobby Kennedy, again about the period a little bit later. I've been essentially preparing for this book for 40 years.
You say that President Eisenhower did not want a statue of himself as a memorial.
Yeah.
What would you, and I don't know how many people know what's been going on in this town about the Frank Gehry architect version. What would he think of this whole discussion?
Susan Eisenhower feels very strongly about this, thinks that he would have hated what's going on. I don't know. I don't think he would have loved Frank Gehry's design, but I don't know that. He said offhandedly to Susan and others in his family, "Don't let him put me on a horse." He was a modest guy, but like most modest guys, there's a little vanity in there. He would have wanted some kind of memorial. Would it have been Frank Gehry's? I doubt it. But, Ike was a traditionalist, and I'm not sure modern design was his thing. But he might have liked the theme of modesty of the barefoot boy from Kansas. He might have thought that was a good idea. Maybe not rendered that way, but he might have gone for the theme. It's hard to read Ike's mind.
PSYOP.
The single integrated operating plan for nuking the Soviet Union.
And others?
And China, too. It was the throw the entire nuclear closet at the communists. And Eisenhower, when the Navy was having its own nuclear posture and the Air Force, Ike said we need to have one single integrated operating plan. When he saw it in November 1960, just as he was leaving office, he was pretty upset by it because it was a kitchen sink operation and it was making the rubble bounce. I mean, it was way out there. Other presidents would get briefed on the PSYOP, which continued. I think there probably still is a PSYOP. But when Kennedy saw it ready, he said to Dean Rusk, "And they call us human beings." It was so drastic and draconian what we were going to do. It really was a plan to end the world.
Why?
Well, we wanted to have overkill, as they say, because we didn't want the Soviets to even think about it. Curtis LeMay was sort of useful. Curtis LeMay was the head of the Strategic Air Command. People have seen Dr. Strangelove, have seen the parody of him, General Jack D. Ripper chomping the cigar, And LeMay was a very tough bomber commander from World War II who built the Strategic Air Command, was a great general and a great leader, but he was on the leash. I kept him on a leash, but he was straining at that leash. And, it's hard to know for sure, but LeMay sort of wanted to do a preemptive strike. He thought early in the nuclear buildup that before the Russians got too strong, that the Strategic Air Command could have gone first and just taken them out. Eisenhower actually considered doing that. I mean, in fact, so there was a moral argument for going first before the Soviets could build up. Now, they rejected that idea. They didn't do it because it was ultimately immoral and draconian and godless. But they had to think about it because they had to consider, well, maybe before the Russians can hit us, we should hit them.
The number, and you have it in the book, of nuclear weapons that we had in this country when he started as president and the number he had when he left as president.
It went from about 1,000 to 20,000. I fault Ike for this a little bit. I think there was too much of a buildup here. Ike wanted to send the message, we are unstoppable, strong, we will crush you if you even think about it. But in doing that, the nuclear genie got out of the bottle in a big way, and we had lots of tactical weapons and submarine-launched weapons and bomb drop weapons and missiles towards the end. And there is a view that we overdid, that arsenal got too big.
You refer in your book to the Sunday night dinners in Georgetown.
Yeah. This is the sort of chattering class, high chattering class, the Alsop brothers, Bolin, the well-to-do tended to go to Harvard or Yale. The cool crowd, sort of in the cafeteria.
And where did you go?
I went to Harvard.
And where are you teaching?
Princeton. It's a world I'm familiar with. My father was a book publisher and was peripherally part of this world. So I worked for Katharine Graham at the Washington Post for many years, so I went to dinner at her house. So I do know something about this world. I'm a later generation, but I saw it. And it was the in crowd, and they had very smart, very able people, but they could be snooty. Richard Nixon never quite recovered from going to one of these Sunday night suppers and being snubbed by Averell Harriman. I mean, Nixon's resentment against the establishment and the Harvards and the Yales was rooted in part in going to this dinner and being snubbed by it.
As long as we're talking about you for a moment, back when we did book notes in 1995, here is a clip that talks about your own politics.
And I think that my background growing up in the 60s, going to Harvard at a time that it was pretty liberal, I had a liberal sensibility, but I came from a conservative background, and the combination gave me a sense of curiosity, a sort of a skeptical curiosity and fascination with the workings of the American aristocracy.
Have those terms changed any since 1995?
No, I mean, I'm still curious. I look younger, but I still, I was younger then, but I haven't really changed. I mean, I'm still curious about it. I did come from a liberal background. I got more conservative. I'm sort of a mushy moderate now. I would say I'm unpredictable. Some weeks I agree with Charles Krauthammer, and some weeks I agree with Mark Shields on a TV show that I'm on. So my politics have become more unpredictable, but the source of my curiosity, coming from a liberal background, but having grown up in a fairly rich and conservative environment, created a kind of yin-yang thing for me that helped spur my curiosity.
What was conservative about your environment?
I grew up in a town full of lawyers on Cold Spring Harbor, New York, and they voted Republican. My parents voted Democrat. So I grew up in a conservative, kind of preppy environment, upper middle class, and I was always a little skeptical of that. I was brought up to be skeptical. My grandfather was a socialist. Norman Thomas ran for president 6 times as a socialist. So I came from both worlds, pretty strongly from both worlds, and they a little confusing at times, but also I hope bred in me a healthy curiosity and made me not too literal and not to believe everything.
While we're on your personal stuff, when did you get married, and how many kids do you have?
I got married in 1975, right out of, I was in law school, to my wife of many years, O.C. Freer, and we have two daughters, ages 31 and 28. One's a writer, professional writer, and the other is a construction manager.
Construction manager of what?
She's building a building here. She's the assistant construction manager, Mary, working for Hines, which is a real estate developer, building a 10-story building at, I guess it's 6th and K right now.
And what kind of writing is your other daughter doing?
Louisa wrote a book called Conscience that came out to pretty good reviews a year or two ago about conscience objectors in World War I. She's now writing a biography of Louisa Adams, who is was the wife of John Quincy Adams. She's also a sports writer for ESPN for a blog called Grantland.
You open your book this way. At 8:30 on the night of January the 17th, 1961, President Dwight Eisenhower gave his farewell address from the Oval Office. Even after years of coaching from actor Robert Montgomery, Eisenhower did not look comfortable giving his televised speech. Robert Montgomery, what role did he play in his life, and who was he?
He was an actor brought into the White House to coach Ike on being better at TV, and Ike drove Montgomery crazy. At one point, they covered all the electronic equipment, the cameras, in black, so that Ike wouldn't see it, so he wouldn't be distracted by it. Ike was a good public speaker, but he had trouble with the teleprompter.
Then you write he disliked using a teleprompter, and he began by glancing down and reading from the printed text on his desk. He paused, blinked, looked up at the lines on the screen, looked back down at the speech, lost his place, and tripped over a word. Why did you choose to begin the book this way?
I wanted to capture his, well, one thing, his most important speech he gave, but I wanted to personalize it right away, get you in the head of the, and picture, and also subliminally let you know that this great man was a human being. You know, he was like the rest of us. He could make mistakes. It's very important to signal the reader that this is a real person that you're about to read about.
We'll see how well you described it. We're going to look at the beginning of the speech.
This evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. Like every other citizen, I wish the new president and all who will labor with him Godspeed. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Why was that speech so important?
It warned against the military-industrial complex, which has become a cliche now. People didn't pay much of attention to the speech at the moment, but they sure have since then. And Ike spent much of his presidency making sure the military didn't get out of hand. He was only partially successful. We just talked about how he let nuclear weapons build up. But he kept military spending about steady. That was very hard to do in the 1950s. Tremendous pressure. We were creating this whole nuclear arsenal, rockets, all that. Ike gutted his own service, the Army. Really cut it, in order to have the money to buy the missiles. That was not an easy thing to do. Military spending in the 1950s was 70% of the federal budget. Today it's about 25%, I think. So it was the big ticket item. And Ike really believed we had to control federal spending, even if that meant holding the line on military spending, even as the Cold War was building up and there were all these threats. It was kind of a hidden victory. People didn't really pay attention to it at the time. In fact, Ike took a lot of grief from Democrats who accused him of, you know, there's a missile gap and you're not building fast enough. Ike stuck to his guns, so to speak, did not overspend, kept the federal budget under control, kept taxes from going too high, quietly helped preserve the prosperity of the country by controlling his own military, and warned that in the future presidents would have to do the same.
Do you remember whether the budget was balanced back in his day?
It was almost budget. He was a balanced budget. It wasn't literally, but it was within. It was close to balance.
Do you happen to remember what the tax rate was then?
Well, very high for millionaires, like 70% or something. For high income, maybe even been 90. World War II, the tax rate went way up, and it only got gradually whittled down in the 50s and 60s. I think Kennedy cut the tax rate at the very high end. It was a little misleading because rich people had a way of getting around those tax rates, but tax rates were a lot higher in the 1950s than they are today. What's
your sense of what's happened to us since Dwight Eisenhower was president? If 70% of the budget was defense, and now it's down to 25%.
Well, we much more spend our money on entitlement programs, on writing checks to seniors and to poor people. That's the whole budget has changed that way, and it's a big obligation. Not easy to cut back on those entitlement programs, and it is the next president, the current president, and the next president, and the president after that, will have to face this extraordinary challenge of reining in our heavy expenditures on checks for you and me, and for the elderly and for the sick. Boy, is that going to be hard to do, but it is the challenge of leadership. And we're going to need somebody like Eisenhower, who is willing to take on tremendous responsibility himself and make the hard choices and do the hard thing.
When he was president, what did people write about the most?
They're sort of snotty. I mean, the liberal press was a little snotty about him as being kind of boring and golf playing. He took a lot of grief for that. But generally the tenor was still war hero and, most importantly, the man we can trust. His approval rating as president was 65% over 8 years. That's a big number. That's more than what's Obama's now. It's in the 40s maybe. Most modern presidents are around 50 if they're lucky. Ike was at 65%. So the country trusted him, believed in him, and the press to a large degree reflected that, although, as I said, the liberal Northeast press was a little snooty about him.
Joe Alsop.
Joe Alsop.
Who was he? What was his relationship to Eisenhower? What did President Eisenhower say to his own staff people about their relationship with people in the media?
Alsop, a figure is sort of forgotten now, was a very influential columnist in his day at the now defunct New York Herald Tribune. And Alsop very influentially talked about the missile gap and the bomber gap. These were these fictional gaps that suggested that the Soviet Union had more bombers and missiles than the United States. It wasn't true. Eisenhower knew it wasn't true. But he knew from secret intelligence, from that spy plane, which he could never admit to, the U-2 that flew over the Soviet Union. So Ike couldn't tell the public about the U-2. So he couldn't say, hey, there is no bomber gap, there's no missile gap in any convincing way. He was a little bit trapped. Meanwhile, Alsop was going on and on, being fed phony intelligence by Senator Symington and others. Air Force fed him a lot of that. There was this big gap, and drove Ike crazy. And Ike would throw the newspaper across the room, have a temper tantrum, hated Alsop because Alsop had a way of digging at, like a lot of presidents, Ike pretended not to read the newspaper. A lot of presidents say that, don't believe it. Ike carefully read the newspaper, and when he'd see Alsop, he would get mad. Alsop hurt him.
Yeah, we talked earlier about the Ann Whitman diaries. We talked about Howard Snyder, the doctor, but you also looked at diaries of Emmett John Hughes.
Yeah, they're at Princeton. Hughes was a speechwriter and a very kind of literary figure. Eisenhower ended up not liking Hughes because Hughes wrote a book about Eisenhower, about the Eisenhower administration, that was not all that flattering. And Hughes had a big ego. You have to be a little careful using Hughes's own biography. He exaggerates a little bit, but his diaries at least are contemporaneous, and they're at Princeton. So I use the diaries more than the Hughes memoir.
How extensive were they?
Well, not every day, but pretty extensive, and around and not Hughes leaves after a couple of years, and then he's brought in sporadically. But they're very useful for the first couple of years of Eisenhower's administration.
Diaries of C.D. Jackson?
C.D. Jackson was a kind of something that was hard to imagine today, the psychological warfare advisor. He was a Time Inc. guy, had lots of theories, lots of ideas, most of them bad, a few of them good. Ike liked to have him around to kind of rev up the conversation, but C.D. Jackson was way out there on wanting to do crazy covert action against the Soviet Union.
And by the way, of all these diaries, who had the best penmanship?
Well, some are typed, or have been typed up, fortunately. The ones I read really are all typed up.
Who was the best writer?
Well, I would say Hughes was the most writerly. Maybe the most honest, though, was Snyder.
Who's Bernard Shanley?
Bernard Shanley was kind of a confidential appointments secretary, not substantive, but was a New Jersey lawyer, bit of a hack. But kept pretty copious diaries and was good about sort of what it felt to be like to be around Ike, and both captured Ike's charm and his anger.
So, going back and looking at that time period, 52 to end of 60, and looking at the president, compare that with today, a Jim Hagerty versus a Jay Carney.
Well, Jim Hagerty, the press secretary, had real control. I don't think that poor Carney, with all the bloggers, and the press is so much more adversarial. The press was not as adversarial in the 1950s. They would drink with Hagerty, and they'd hang around with Hagerty, and they kind of did what Hagerty told them to do. There are important exceptions to this. Drew Pearson was a muckraker even then in the 1950s, and some columnists could be critical and dispassionate. James Reston, would take a step back every once in a while, Walter Lippmann. But generally the press corps was pretty obescent, if not supine, before Hagerty. He was a very clever guy, former New York Times reporter, pretty good press secretary, and the press was pretty tame around Hagerty. Carney couldn't possibly pull that off, even if he wanted to.
Did you work with him at time or at Newsweek?
I knew Jay, very smart guy, younger, but I'm not sure how much younger than me he is, but he's a lot younger. And he was a young star. He was like a summer intern when I was at Time years ago. And he was a young star and had a good career and was done well.
Hagerty left and went to ABC?
You know, I forgot that, but I guess he did. Where did he go after Ike? ABC, that could be.
I think he was head of news for ABC.
Yeah, could be. Very smart guy.
And what about looking today at Jacob Lew, the chief of staff to President Obama? Compare him to Sherman Adams.
Wow, I mean, it's just such, Washington's so different. It's so, you could keep secrets in the 1950s. The president didn't have to always be out there blabbing and raising money. I mean, Ike didn't have to go out and raise a lot of money. It was sort of raised for him. He didn't even have to campaign. He barely campaigned in 1956. He was able to float above it. Of course, Obama can't do that now. He's raising money. He's out there smacking Romney. It's just so different.
What about the chief of staff's job? In other words, Sherman Adams got in trouble.
He did. He got caught in a little scandal. Now, this is modern, because he operated behind the radar screen. He made a lot of enemies by being Dr. No. He was the abominable no man, and so he made enemies. So when he was caught with a minor peccadillo, taking favors from a lobbyist named Goldfein.
He was a former governor of New Hampshire?
He was a former governor of New Hampshire. A dour, acerbic New Englander, did not say goodbye on the phone, just would hang up on you. So he did get caught, and this presages the modern press. He got caught in a little scandal, taking favors from a lobbyist. A minor thing, but he had no friends in Washington, because he'd said no to everybody who was trying to get into the president, and he was too acerbic. And so when he got in trouble, there was no reservoir of loyalty or friendship. And Ike had to cut him loose, which really pained Ike. Had to let him go.
I hate to do this to you, but we had you back in 1995. We also have you back in 1983.
Oh, no.
Here you are.
There are a couple of competing forces at work. One is young reporters like me are ambitious, and they want to get ahead, and they want to get on page one. And that can lead you to take liberties that you shouldn't. But balanced against that, and usually outweighing it, is a terrible fear of being wrong. There is nothing, believe me, nothing worse for a journalist than to be wrong and to be caught at it. And you do get caught. It's just the most sinking feeling to print of something that's factually wrong, especially something that hurts people.
Today is 30 years later. Did you do what you wanted to do in journalism?
Oh, yeah. I've been so lucky. I had a great run. Time and Newsweek were wonderful to me. I had great jobs. I was the bureau chief here in Washington. I was editor-at-large. I was assistant managing editor. I got to write lots of great, I wrote more than 100 cover stories with a lot of help, I should say. So I was really, really lucky. And I was able to write books at the same time, and I was able to blend my weekly or day-to-day journalism with my history. One informed the other constantly, and I've been blessed.
So what's your life like now?
I teach at Princeton. I teach a writing course, which I love. I got really smart kids. I've been doing this. This is year 6, and I've taught at Harvard and Princeton before that. So I've done a bunch of teaching. Mostly writing and journalism, and also how to avoid reporters. I teach future public officials how to deal with the press. That's a great reward to me. And I write books. I'm always got a book cooking. Always thinking about a next book. So I have a pretty good balance still.
How long did this book take to write? The whole process and research?
3.5, 4 years from the time I first started thinking about it to have sitting in your hand.
When did you finish it?
Well, it's always hard. What is finishing a book? When did I really finish it? 6 months ago. I mean, you're fiddling with it up to the very end. I had a very great editor named Jeff Chandler at Little Brown, a really, really good pencil editor, and he was fiddling to the end. I've had a lot of friends who helped me. My wife is an incredibly good editor. So you're fiddling with a book until the last possible minute.
And do you have another one you're working on now?
I'm thinking about stuff. I can't talk about it now, but of course I'm thinking about a next book.
So why can't you talk about it?
Because I haven't decided what it is, and until I do, I don't want to talk about it.
What, in your opinion, after all these books you've written, do you have to have in order to even start thinking about doing a book on something?
We have to be curious about a subject. The great thing about being a journalist and a popular historian is I don't have a narrow specialty. I can do what interests me. And so I've done the late 19th century imperialism. I've done a naval captain, John Paul Jones, in the late 18th century. I've done more. If I have a specialty, it's post-war Washington, power in post-war Washington, foreign policy in post-war Washington, the whole generation that came out of World War II and tried to make the world a better and safer place. That was my father's generation, fascinates me. I think that's what I've written the most about and probably the best about.
And your father died, what, back in 1999?
Yes.
And what was his job?
He was a book publisher, so I got to meet some of these. He published John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and I got to meet some of these figures. He published various statesmen and senators, and so I was exposed as a child to the world that I write about now.
If you had to list the most impressive people you've ever known in the public life, who would that be?
Well, Katharine Graham, my old boss, she was partly because she was so human. You know, I liked her insecurities and her toughness and her bravery. I think she stands out. I've worked a lot with her. In public life, who was the most impressive guy? Boy, that's hard to say. I mean, I wrote a biography of Bobby Kennedy, who always intrigued me and had a kind of a hidden power. I never met Eisenhower.
Did you meet Bobby Kennedy?
Yes, he signed my biology book when I was in high school. I went to Andover and he was looking at the school for his kid and he signed it. And I talked to him on the phone briefly once because my father published him and he was calling, looking for my father. But I had a kind of a fascination with Bobby Kennedy that I wrote about. Where
would General President Dwight Eisenhower be in your list of most popular presidents?
Well, I put him on Rushmore. Because he had, and he's not there naturally, but he had a kind of judgment and wisdom, quiet, confident judgment and wisdom that I believe kept us safe and prosperous at a dangerous time. And we think of the 1950s as boring. They were boring because Ike made them boring. They didn't have to be that way. Lots of things could have gone wrong in that period, and Eisenhower is getting now. There is a spate of books about him. I'm the third book, I think, this year, third Eisenhower book this year. He deserves that recognition, and he's getting it.
The name of the book is Ike's Bluff, President Eisenhower's Secret Battle to Save the World. Our guest has been Evan Thomas, and we thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts, or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.